Imagine a world cloaked in shadows, a time when darkness ruled the minds of men, when knowledge was chained and the walls of ignorance stood tall and unbroken. Then, suddenly, from within those very walls came a light, a spark so dazzling that it forever changed the course of history. That spark was the Renaissance. The Renaissance was more than an era. It was Europe's heartbeat of rebirth, a symphony of art, science, and discovery, from the brushstrokes of Michelangelo to the genius of Leonardo da Vinci, from the printing press of Gutenberg to the cosmic revelations of Galileo. The Renaissance wasn't just history, it was the dawn of modern humanity. And tonight, together, we'll step behind the walls of mystery, peel back the layers of brilliance, and unlock the secrets of this golden age. Prepare yourself for thrilling discoveries, mind-blowing truths, and fascinating stories that shape the very world we live in today. But before we unlock these hidden doors, don't forget, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment with your favorite part of history, because your voice is part of this journey too. The story begins with fire, steel, and the fall of walls that had stood for 1,000 years. In the year 1453, Constantinople, the crown jewel of the Byzantine Empire, was surrounded. Its once impenetrable walls, which had defied armies for centuries, now trembled under the thunder of cannons. The great city, long a bridge between east and west, fell to the forces of the Ottoman Empire. But while the empire crumbled, while churches turned to mosques and citizens fled in fear, something extraordinary was happening in the shadows of defeat. Knowledge, scrolls, manuscripts, ancient Greek texts, the wisdom of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle escaped the burning city. Carried by fleeing scholars, hidden in satchels, tucked under robes, these treasures of thought made their way into Europe. And Europe, hungry for answers, would never be the same. The fall of Constantinople was more than just the collapse of a city. It was the unlocking of a vault that had been sealed for ages. For centuries, much of Europe had been closed within its own medieval fortress, clinging to rigid traditions, fearful of challenging authority, bound to the rhythms of feudal life. But as the city fell, the walls of ignorance began to crack. Suddenly, texts thought lost were alive again. Ideas that had been whispered in ancient Athens, that had once lit the fires of Rome, returned to spark the minds of Renaissance thinkers. In a single generation, Europe inherited the intellectual lifeblood of a fallen empire. Picture the scene: scholars arriving in Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, their arms full of manuscripts in Greek and Latin, their minds burning with the urgency of preservation. These weren't just books, they were keys to a forgotten universe. Knowledge of medicine, astronomy, philosophy, mathematics, and art poured into the hands of men who were ready to listen. The wealthy Medici family in Florence, eager patrons of brilliance, opened their doors to these exiles and their treasures. And in the quiet rooms of libraries under candlelight, the Renaissance began to stir. But the impact reached far beyond dusty manuscripts. With Constantinople in Ottoman hands, trade routes that had once linked Europe to the riches of the East were disrupted. Spices, silk, and gold no longer flowed as freely. The European hunger for connection demanded new paths, and so explorers and navigators turned their eyes to the seas. What if there was another way to India, another route to China? The fall of one city, the collapse of one empire, set in motion the great voyages of discovery that would send ships westward into uncharted oceans. Columbus, Magellan, Vespucci, all of their journeys carried the shadow of Constantinople's fall. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of 1453 was not what was lost, but what was found. Out of defeat came rebirth. The death of one world fed the birth of another. The Renaissance, this brilliant rebirth of art, science, and human imagination, carried in its bloodstream the DNA of Byzantium. The city's libraries became Europe's inheritance, its scholars became Europe's teachers, its fall became Europe's rise. And imagine the irony. The cannons that tore down the mighty walls of Constantinople also tore down the walls of Europe's dark age. The very destruction of one civilization became the foundation stones for another. What had once been guarded within the walls of the Eastern Empire now poured across borders, igniting curiosity, challenging dogma, and daring men to see the world anew. When we speak of the Renaissance as Europe's most brilliant era of discovery, it is impossible to forget that it began in the ashes of collapse. The night that Constantinople burned was also the dawn of a new age. One empire ended, but in its end, it passed on the torch that would light Europe for centuries to come. In the middle of the 15th century, in a quiet workshop in Mainz, Germany, an invention was being crafted that would change the very heartbeat of Europe. Its creator was Johannes Gutenberg, a man who understood that the greatest walls weren't built of stone, they were built of silence, of secrets, of knowledge kept locked away from ordinary people. For centuries, books had been chained to monasteries, copied by hand with painstaking care, guarded by the few and the privileged. To own a book was to hold wealth beyond gold, for each page represented months of labor. Knowledge moved slowly, whispered from monk to monk, scholar to scholar, and in this silence, ignorance thrived. Gutenberg's genius shattered that silence. His printing press was more than wood, metal, and ink. It was a key, a weapon, a revolution disguised as a machine. By combining movable type with the mechanics of a press, he created something miraculous, books that could be copied not in years, but in days, not in dozens, but in thousands. For the first time in history, words were no longer prisoners. They could run free. They could reach beyond the walls of monasteries, beyond the palaces of kings, into the homes of merchants, artisans, and dreamers. Imagine the scene, the smell of ink thick in the air, the press creaking as sheets of paper rolled out one after another. Pages filled with stories, laws, scriptures, and poems, pages that once existed only for the chosen few now multiplying endlessly. When the first printed Bible emerged from Gutenberg's press, it was not merely a religious text, it was a declaration. Knowledge belonged not to the gatekeepers, but to the people, and the effects rippled like fire through dry grass. Universities flourished, for students could finally hold in their hands the very text they studied. Ideas no longer trickled slowly across Europe, they surged like a river. Ancient Greek and Roman works rediscovered after the fall of Constantinople now spread far and wide. The philosophies of Plato, the science of Galen, the visions of Ptolemy, all danced across the continent on ink-stained paper, and new voices rose as well. Humanists, artists, scientists, bold enough to question, to debate, to dream. But the printing press was not just about the preservation of knowledge, it was about the creation of revolution. Once ideas could no longer be contained, authority began to tremble. The church, long the guardian of sacred texts, found its monopoly shattered. Scholars began to argue, reformers began to write, and the seeds of movements like the Reformation were planted in the fertile soil of printed words. Luther's theses, nailed to a church door, became a storm across Europe only because the press multiplied them, carrying them into villages and towns, reaching the hands of farmers and craftsmen who had never before had access to such ideas. Art, too, found new wings. Manuals on painting, architecture, and anatomy were published, allowing the genius of artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo to travel beyond their workshops. Music was printed, maps were printed, discoveries were printed. The age of the Renaissance wasn't just painted on ceilings or carved in marble, it was inked onto paper and pressed into history. And think of the irony, the walls of Constantinople had fallen in fire, pushing knowledge westward. Yet without Gutenberg's press, those precious manuscripts would have remained locked away once more. The fall of an empire provided the treasure, but the printing press spread it to the world. Together they created the perfect storm. So when we look at the Renaissance and call it Europe's most brilliant era of discovery, we must remember this. Without the press, the light of knowledge would have flickered only in the halls of the elite. With it, the flame spread to every corner of Europe, unstoppable, undeniable. Gutenberg didn't just invent a machine, he gave birth to an age where curiosity had no chains, where walls of ignorance crumbled, and where the written word became humanity's most powerful weapon. In the heart of Florence, beneath the arches of cathedrals and inside the bustling squares, a revolution unlike any other was taking shape. It wasn't a clash of swords or a roar of cannons, it was a revolution painted in color, sculpted in marble, and breathed into frescoes that touched the very heavens. The Renaissance was the moment when art ceased to be bound by rigid tradition and instead became a mirror of life itself, a force so powerful that it redefined how humanity saw the world and even how it saw itself. For centuries, art had been solemn, flat, symbolic, icons painted not to inspire curiosity, but to instruct devotion. The medieval canvas was a window, but a narrow one, bound by rules and hierarchy. Then came the Renaissance, and with it, a daring question: what if art could not only honor God, but also capture the human soul? What if it could show not just halos, but heartbeats? Suddenly the world opened up, and with it, an artistic revolution unlike anything Europe had ever known. Imagine Michelangelo standing before a block of marble, the cold stone unyielding, yet within it, he saw something alive. With each strike of his chisel, David emerged, veins visible, muscles tense, eyes fierce with defiance. This was no lifeless statue. It was humanity immortalized, flesh and spirit made eternal in stone. Or picture Leonardo da Vinci, brush in hand, staring into the eyes of a woman who would become the Mona Lisa. That mysterious smile, caught between shadow and light, would mesmerize generations. It wasn't just a portrait, it was a puzzle, a whisper from the depths of the human psyche. These weren't simply artists, they were visionaries, scientists of form and feeling, explorers of perspective and proportion. They dissected corpses to understand anatomy, mapped geometry into their compositions, and infused their creations with mathematics as much as with emotion. Their art was not only beautiful, it was alive with intellect, a fusion of reason and wonder that reflected the spirit of the Renaissance itself. And then there were the frescoes, walls and ceilings transformed into portals of eternity. Step into the Sistine Chapel and look upward, and you're not merely gazing at paint, you're staring into a universe. Michelangelo's creation of Adam stretches across the ceiling, God's hand reaching out to man, the spark of life suspended in a breathless gap. For those who entered that chapel, the very air seemed to glow with divinity. It was art that preached, art that taught, art that thundered louder than any sermon. But the revolution wasn't confined to the masters alone. Across Europe, the techniques of perspective, shadow, and realism spread. Painters captured bustling city life, rolling landscapes, and ordinary people with a dignity once reserved only for kings and saints. Books filled with sketches and studies circulated thanks to the printing press, allowing apprentices and dreamers from faraway towns to learn from the greats. Art was no longer a distant treasure, it was a living flame, passed from hand to hand. This artistic awakening reshaped more than culture, it reshaped power. Wealthy families like the Medici saw art as the ultimate expression of influence. By commissioning grand works, they didn't just decorate their cities, they stamped their names into eternity. Churches and rulers competed to fund the most dazzling projects, and in doing so, they fueled the very fire of the Renaissance, turning cities into canvases where genius could thrive. And what made it all so radical was not just the skill or the beauty, but the daring message at its core. Art declared that man was not insignificant, not merely a shadow beneath divine light. Man was magnificent, complex, worthy of being studied, celebrated, and remembered. In every brushstroke, every sculpture, every masterpiece, the Renaissance shouted to the world, "We are more than subjects, we are creators." The artistic revolution of the Renaissance was not just about paintings and sculptures, it was about rediscovering the human spirit. It was the breaking of chains, the tearing down of walls that once confined imagination, and the birth of a new vision where creativity itself became a kind of power. And through that power, the Renaissance etched itself into history, not with ink or sword, but with color, marble, and a beauty so profound it still speaks across the centuries. The Renaissance was not only an age of beauty painted on ceilings and carved in marble, it was an age when the very fabric of the universe was questioned. For centuries, people had looked to the heavens and believed they understood their place Earth at the center, stars fixed like jewels upon a perfect dome, the cosmos ruled by divine order. To doubt this order was to challenge not only science, but God himself. Yet, in the quiet studies of scholars under flickering candlelight, brave men and women began to ask forbidden questions. What if the universe was not as the ancients had described? What if the heavens held secrets far stranger, far more infinite than anyone dared imagine? One of the earliest voices to whisper this heresy was Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish mathematician and astronomer. In the stillness of his observatory, he tracked the movements of planets across the night sky. The old Ptolemaic system, with its circles upon circles, its elaborate attempts to explain the erratic dance of Mars and Venus, seemed clumsy, even wrong. And then Copernicus saw it the Earth was not the center. The sun was. A simple, daring truth that all the planets, including our own, revolved around a brilliant star. For decades, he kept this revelation quiet, fearing the backlash. But once it was written, once his book spread, the very ground beneath humanity's feet shifted. Not long after, Galileo Galilei lifted his handmade telescope to the sky and brought Copernicus' theory to life. Imagine his astonishment. The moon, far from a flawless orb, scarred with craters and mountains. Jupiter, circled by 4 moons of its own, proving that Earth was not the universe's anchor. The Milky Way, once thought a faint band of light, revealed itself as countless stars stretching into infinity. With every discovery, the heavens grew larger, stranger, and more magnificent. Yet his courage came at a price. The church summoned him, demanded he recant, and branded his telescope not as a tool of wonder but as a threat. Galileo was silenced, confined, yet his vision had already ignited Europe. And the breakthroughs didn't stop at the stars. Andries Vesalius, studying the human body, dared to open it with his own hands. He dissected cadavers and revealed a truth that no medieval text had fully captured. The body was a machine of breathtaking complexity. His book De Humani Corporis Fabrica replaced myth with muscle, diagram by diagram, vein by vein. For the first time, doctors could see the truth of their own flesh, knowledge that saved lives, and advanced medicine beyond superstition. In laboratories and workshops, alchemy gave way to chemistry. Mathematics, once an abstract puzzle, became a language to measure the universe itself. Engineers like Leonardo da Vinci sketched machines that seemed to defy the very limits of imagination. Flying contraptions, armored vehicles, bridges that bent nature to human will. He may not have built them all, but the spark was there, the belief that invention was possible, that man could shape the future with reason and creativity. The true revolution of Renaissance science was not only in what was discovered, but in how it was discovered. Observation replaced blind faith, experimentation replaced tradition, and evidence replaced authority. The walls of dogma that had contained human thought for centuries began to crumble. The mysteries of the universe were no longer hidden behind cloisters and scripture. They were waiting in the stars, in the human body, in the workings of nature itself. And this was perhaps the most profound shift of all. Knowledge was no longer seen as dangerous, but as liberating. To study the heavens, to dissect the body, to challenge the old maps of thought was not rebellion, it was progress. The Renaissance scientist was both heretic and hero, condemned by some but celebrated by history. Their discoveries laid the foundation for the modern world, for the age of reason, for everything we now take for granted when we look through telescopes, read medical charts, or harness machines powered by science. The Renaissance was Europe's rebirth, yes, but its scientific breakthroughs were its heartbeat. They gave humanity permission to ask questions, to seek answers, to gaze at the stars and see not fear but possibility. And from that moment forward, the world was no longer a mystery to endure, it was a puzzle to solve. It began with a whisper, soft at first, but growing louder with every generation. For centuries, the focus of life in Europe had been fixed on heaven, on salvation, on enduring this world for the promise of another. But in the Renaissance, a daring new idea began to spread. What if man himself was worthy of study, of celebration, of honor? What if the measure of truth was not only scripture or tradition, but also the power of human reason, imagination, and experience? This whisper became a philosophy, a movement, a revolution of the mind. It was called humanism. Humanism was not a rejection of faith, but it was a bold rebalancing. Instead of seeing man as a fragile sinner crawling toward redemption, it lifted him as a being of potential, capable of greatness, learning, and virtue. Ancient texts, long buried in monasteries or forgotten in dusty corners, were rediscovered. The works of Cicero, Seneca, Aristotle, and Plato were read again, not as relics, but as guides. Their voices, echoing across centuries, reminded Europe that wisdom had many sources, and that man could seek truth, not only in the divine, but also in himself. Picture the scholars of Florence or Padua, bent over manuscripts, translating and debating with fiery passion. They saw in the words of the ancients a philosophy that embraced reason and dignity. And they asked a radical question: if the Greeks and Romans had once celebrated the power of human thought, why couldn't Europe do the same? This spirit of rediscovery fueled not just libraries and universities, but the very culture of the Renaissance. Education became the beating heart of this movement. The humanists believed that every man, regardless of birth, could be improved through knowledge. They taught not only theology, but literature, history, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. To read the poetry of Virgil, to study the speeches of Cicero was to sharpen the mind and the soul. Schools expanded, universities flourished, and a new generation was raised to see themselves not as subjects bound to authority, but as thinkers capable of shaping their own destiny. Art and philosophy intertwined here as well. When Michelangelo sculpted David, when Raphael painted his School of Athens, they were not only creating beauty, they were declaring that man himself was magnificent, capable of reflection, courage, and wisdom. The School of Athens, with Plato pointing upward and Aristotle gesturing outward, was more than a fresco. It was a statement truth is found both in the heavens and on the earth, both in divine thought and human reason. This shift transformed politics too. Thinkers like Machiavelli, controversial and unflinching, asked what it truly meant to rule, to wield power, to survive in the harsh theater of human ambition. His The Prince was not a sermon but a mirror, reflecting the complexities of man's nature and the realities of leadership. It shocked some, inspired others, but it forced Europe to see politics not as sacred order, but as human struggle. Even religion itself felt the force of humanism. Reformers, emboldened by the belief in the power of reason and the worth of the individual, began to challenge centuries of tradition. They ask, why should Scripture be locked in Latin? Why not in the language of the people? Why should faith be mediated by hierarchy when man could read and think for himself? The answers they pursued ignited debates that shook the church and split Christendom forever. Humanism was not without its critics. To some, it was dangerous pride, a turning away from God toward the arrogance of man. But history tells another story. It was not arrogance, but awakening. It was a rediscovery of balance, the divine above, yes, but also the human here and now. It was a call to celebrate not only what we hope to become, but also what we already are, beings capable of thought, of art, of greatness. In the Renaissance, humanism became the key that unlocked the soul of Europe. It taught men and women to look into the mirror and see not dust and sin, but potential and light. It was the courage to believe that to understand man was to honor creation itself. And from that belief grew the philosophies, the art, the politics, and the discoveries that defined an era. The seas had always been there, vast, endless, untamed. For centuries, Europeans gazed at the horizon and wondered what lay beyond, but fear, tradition, and uncertainty held them back. Maps of the medieval world were filled with monsters, warnings, and empty spaces labeled hair-bee dragons. Yet the Renaissance, with its spirit of curiosity, with its hunger for knowledge and discovery, tore down those imaginary walls. If the fall of Constantinople had closed old trade routes, and if new ideas had reminded Europe of its boundless potential, then the oceans became the next great frontier. And so began an age of exploration that would stretch the limits of imagination and redraw the map of the world forever. It started with daring voyages along the African coast, where Portuguese sailors like Prince Henry the Navigator pushed further and further south, mapping new lands and currents. Soon, caravels, sleek and swift, cut through waters no European had dared sail before. Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that Africa could be circled, and Vasco da Gama reached India, carrying Europe into the heart of the spice trade. These were not just voyages of commerce, they were voyages of revelation. Each new shoreline, each new port was a doorway into the unknown, but the most daring leap came in 1492, when Christopher Columbus set his sails westward. Driven by the dream of finding a new route to Asia, he stumbled instead upon lands that no European had imagined, a continent brimming with life resources and mystery. Though his arrival marked the beginning of conquest and tragedy for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, it also marked a turning point in history. The world was no longer divided into the familiar and the feared. It was suddenly, thrillingly vast and interconnected. Soon after, explorers like Ferdinand Magellan circled the globe, proving that the Earth was not only round but far larger and more complex than anyone had believed. Amerigo Vespucci mapped enough of the new lands that his name would forever mark the continents. The age of global exploration was not just about land and sea, it was about discovery itself, about challenging the boundaries of what was known and daring to see beyond them. The impact rippled across Europe. Exotic spices, silks, gold, and silver poured in, transforming economies. New crops like potatoes, tomatoes, and maize reshaped diets and societies. Knowledge of geography expanded, as did the blending of cultures, sometimes through exchange, often through conquest. It was a time of wonder and wealth, but also of conflict and cruelty. The Renaissance spirit of curiosity had unlocked the globe, but it also unleashed struggles over empires, trade, and power that would define the centuries to come. And yet, at its heart, this age of exploration reflected the very essence of the Renaissance, the refusal to accept limits, the courage to challenge what was known, the drive to push into the unknown no matter the cost. Sailors stared at the same stars Galileo studied, guided by mathematics, by compass, by faith, and by unshakable human will. Every voyage carried both fear and hope. Every landing reshaped the understanding of what the world could be. The Renaissance had begun with the fall of a city and the rediscovery of old knowledge. It grew with the power of the printing press, the brushstrokes of genius, the revelations of science, and the rise of humanist thought. But it stretched its arms fully when ships left familiar shores and returned with stories of lands and peoples beyond imagining. In those moments, Europe was no longer just a continent, it was part of a world vast, diverse, and waiting to be explored. And so the Renaissance came to its great crescendo, not just in marble statues or painted ceilings, but in sails billowing against the wind, in compasses pointing true north, in maps being redrawn again and again. It was the triumph of curiosity over fear, of courage over doubt, And in that spirit, the world we know today was born, because discovery does not end with maps or voyages. It begins with a question, a spark, a single step into the unknown. And just like those sailors centuries ago, every generation must decide, do we stay behind the walls of what is safe and certain, or do we set sail into the mystery that lies beyond? That is the legacy of the Renaissance, and the invitation it still offers to us all.